So, welcome to another discussion. So, today I've got with me Jonny Hodl, and I have got Jonny on because Jonny is a libertarian, which he will explain if anyone doesn't know what that is. And I've sort of been aware of libertarianism for maybe a couple of years. I'm not like super deep into it or anything, but as soon as when I learned about it, it always seemed to sit quite well with antinatalism. And I thought it would be good to get a libertarian on and just bounce that idea off them and see, what their reaction is. So before we get into well, I mean, we're both vegans here, but before we get into the meat of things, do you just want to go into a bit about who you are? Because you've sort of shot onto the sort of, at least vegan scene anyway, recently with your video with Lauren Southern. But do you just want to go into a bit a bit of what you do and then go into libertarianism as well?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to getting into the discussion. So I guess like in terms of my background, or at least coming kind of into the scene of YouTube and kind of like podcasting and all that kind of stuff. I started a podcast in last year, around a year ago now, called the Staying Free Podcast. And it's generally kind of off the back of everything that happened, with COVID, and it kind of wanted to start having discussions that were talking about, I guess, like ethics and principles. And I felt like society was kind of going in a very, very dark direction, and there was conversations that weren't being had. So I have conversations that generally are themed around, generally it's from a libertarian standpoint of kind of individual sovereignty and individual rights, which we seem to have kind of lost way of, like in the mainstream conversation. They seem to be very much sidelined now. And through that, I kind of met several people from doing interviews and stuff. One of the people I met was the director of a movie called Hoaxed, who made a kind of a documentary there about like fake news and stuff. And then through him, kind of made more connections. One of them being Lauren Southern, who I didn't know much about until we went and did some shooting together. And during that time, obviously, we didn't know each other too well, but she found out that I was vegan. And also libertarian, which is kind of rare. Like most people who are vegans generally have like left-leaning politics and stuff.
Yeah.
So she kind of wanted to explore that a little bit with me. So she did a video, which was, a little tongue-in-cheek, a little bit, teasing and stuff like that. But it did give me an opportunity to like essentially kind of pitch veganism in a way, or the ideas around it, to an audience that is not going to be a vegan audience, generally speaking, like, largely not going to be into that. So I then kind of through that, David Rams gave me the opportunity to go on his channel, and I've done a couple of videos. Is it one or two? I can't remember. I've done
two.
I think, a couple of videos. Yeah, so I did one, and I did a debate one as well recently. So been on his channel, and then like obviously coming on yours. So kind of starting to make myself known a little bit in the vegan community. It's not really what my podcast is about. My podcast actually, unfortunately, I've kind of wanted to have one for a while, but I haven't yet had a conversation about veganism and how it interlinks the philosophy with libertarianism. So I want to do that at some point. But for now, it's just coming on channels like yours and David's, popping in here and there to discuss some of these ideas.
Yeah, carving a name out for yourself. So
Yeah.
do you want to so we've mentioned libertarianism a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just want to go into sort of like the sort of general idea of what libertarianism is, just for, like a beginner's guide for anyone who's watching the video who doesn't really know what it is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so libertarianism, people kind of like define it and look at it in different ways. I think that the word libertarianism doesn't really get to the core of what it actually is about. Other people will use other terms that are a lot less popular. Libertarianism, it's a good label because people understand it. But I would say that there's two other terms which I think more accurately just describe what the philosophy is about. One is voluntarism, and the other is consensualism. Now, voluntarism basically means, that our actions in this world should be voluntary, right? So like the things that you do in the world shouldn't be forced or coerced. And consensualism, I think, goes even a bit deeper than that. And obviously that word might be a little bit triggering to some people. They might think, okay, well, when you think about things like consent, you think about stuff like the age of consent, or consenting to sex or something like that. So it's kind of, it could be deemed like inflammatory. So I generally don't use it, but I do think that there are parallels in terms of what we're actually saying is people have the right to their own action, and they shouldn't be coerced by the mob, right? So people have individual rights, which are kind of
Mm.
are above collective rights, right? So like collective rights can't supersede those individual rights. So like a good example is if you've made your work honestly and you've been paid for something that you goods and services you provide, no one should ever be forced or coerced to buy those products or take those products, whatever it is, right? But then as long as it's a consensual relationship, a consensual transaction, you're operating under that system, you earn money, but then the state shouldn't be able to come and say, okay, now you've got this money, so now we're going to redistribute it to all these other people because they voted to do so, right? So you own your stuff, you have like property rights, which are kind of enshrined, and other people can't just come and take your stuff. So, essentially this kind of flies in the face with a lot of like modern discussion about, things like redistribution of wealth and stuff, because
Mm.
ultimately at the core level, that breaks a fundamental principle which most people profess to have, which is we don't steal from other people, right? There's no logical difference between saying that someone absolutely should be forced to give a homeless person, money out of their pocket, and saying that someone who's earned money honestly, right, through consensual transactions should be forced to then pay for other people's whatever it is, whether it's paid for. And actually, this would be an interesting thing to get onto with you. But for instance,
Mm.
if you don't have kids, you're forced to pay for the education of other people's kids, right? Now,
Mm.
that's just one small example. I don't think that maybe your audience could relate to, but there's many other examples. I mean, you could almost extrapolate that out to literally everything in society, which is people should only be responsible for their own stuff in the world. You shouldn't be forced by law to be responsible for other people. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no ethical reason to care about those things, right? So if you want to go and donate to a charity, that's great. If you want to go and fund a school, if you want to go and fund a homeless shelter, great. I'm all for that. I think that people should do that, and I actually think that under a libertarian society, people would have more of an impulse to do that because it removes the state, right, which is kind of acting as this barrier between people and their own like morality. Everyone just says, oh, well, I pay my taxes, so I don't need to worry about it, right? So we're kind of we're a step removed from that, so it will actually connect people to that more. But that's obviously a side point. So yeah, essentially, it's a philosophy that basically is non-coercive, and it just says that people should be able to make free and voluntary transactions, relationships, etc. in this world based upon property rights. And that really is where everything kind of stems from. So it's kind of a naturally that leads to being generally anti-government, and people would define it in different ways. Some people are what would you call like pure libertarian or like Rothbardian
Mm.
libertarian, which is basically like zero government. Some people will call themselves like maybe minarchists, where there should be some kind of organizational structure in society, but that's all it does. It just stops. It just acts as some kind of pragmatic approach to for instance, ensuring that people's property rights aren't infringed. So maybe you would have a small court system or something like that to ensure that's the case. But yeah, generally I would say that I don't know whether I would call myself a pure libertarian or a minarchist, but I think that like I'm miles and miles away from where most people sit, which is kind of a centrist or center right, whatever. I'm like people should have maximum liberty and freedom in their lives, and we shouldn't operate from saying, okay, well, what's the kind of the greatest overall good. I just think like everyone should. The main thing is that you don't breach fundamental first principles and individual rights. So yeah, that's kind of where libertarian stems from: individual like civil rights and property rights.
Yeah, I've got to say, like, ever since like I said before, like the first I came across libertarianism, or was like aware of it, was a few years ago, and like ever since then, I've had like I'm like sympathetic towards it. Like, it just um I don't know if you find this, but I don't know how to really word it, but like sometimes when you are sort of learning about a new issue, you have a sort of natural center of gravity towards where you always lean.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining myself right, but like when I learned about libertarianism, it sort of described where my sort of natural
Yeah.
center of gravity politically is. But I've never gotten to the point where I would call myself like a libertarian. I want to like, I've got like some libertarian books on my reading list to read, and
Okay. Nice.
yeah. But anyway, so that's irrelevant stuff about me. So about antinatalism, what has your exposure been to it? So, up until now, do you know, like, when I reached out to you for this conversation, was it the first time you'd ever even heard the word, or what's your exposure been to it so far?
Yeah, it is the first time. It's the first time I've heard the word. I mean, I know people who are against, having kids on the basis of things like climate and stuff like that, right? So people are like, oh, well, if you have kids, then that's one of the most damaging things that you can do for the climate, etc. So I've had run-ins with people. I think I mentioned this on David Ram's channel. Like I had a kind of run-in with Gary Francione because I don't think he even describes himself as an antinatalist. Maybe he does, but he's not coming at it from a perspective that I think you are. Because, obviously, just to throw this in there, you obviously sent me a video of your kind of 10 minutes of just a rundown of the philosophy of
Yeah.
antinatalism. And that's very different to my other experiences. So, someone like Gary Francione, he's like, oh, well, we're going to destroy the climate by having kids and stuff. And I definitely strongly disagree with that angle. Now, I'm totally new to your angle and the more philosophical side of it, which isn't based or predicated upon, the climate and stuff like this. So I'm assuming that that's not something that you're going to defend, is the idea that like we shouldn't have kids for the basis of climate, right? Yours is more about whether we have the right to create new life and bring them into a world without their kind of consent or something. Is that getting to the key of it? Maybe it's better.
Yeah.
Maybe rather than me trying to steelman your view, maybe it's better to just give a starting point there.
Yeah, so about Gary Francione, like, honestly, I don't know. Well, I've never seen him really comment on the topic of reproduction, to be honest. So I haven't seen what you've seen, but he strikes me as the sort of guy who would take that position with the environment. I'm not like, I don't like talking about environmental issues when I talk about like having kids. And
Yeah,
I've spoken about this in like a few of my videos. One of the reasons is that, like, to be honest, like, if we're talking about just ethics, like, I'm not trying to impose something on someone else. I'm just trying to, question an action that they might have taken or they might take. But I'm not the sort of person that wants government to get involved and start, like I don't know, restricting people's ability to procreate. I think it should be people, you know, receiving the idea from people like
yeah,
me,
yeah, for
thinking
sure.
about it, and then voluntarily not procreating, right? So I'm
Okay.
I'm definitely not in the camp of, the environment is falling apart and we are contributing to it by having kids. Now that may be the case, but that, for me, that doesn't then jump to, well, the government should start, restricting
Yeah,
or something like that. um and I another reason that I don't think antinatalists should really get involved with the environmental side of pushing the message forward is because it just gets you labeled as an eco-fascist, and which, to be honest, is probably an accurate term for a view like that. um
yeah,
so yeah, I don't come at it from the environmental angle. So yeah, like you said, the angle I come at it from is really about like the person who's being created. And there's a couple different ways that you can approach that, and I think I touch on a few of them in, so the video I sent you is the one that's just called "Why Am I an Antinatalist?" And in that video, I'm not really putting like concrete arguments forward or anything. I'm just talking about like my personal perspective on it. But if I was going to break the actual arguments down for antinatalism, the way I see it is there are four main ones. um the one that There's two which I think we can focus on here, because I think those are the two that are sort of most relevant to libertarianism. So basically, what I'll do now is if you're happy for me just to go straight into it, I'll basically talk about why
yeah,
I
yeah. Go
think
straight into it. Sure.
libertarianism and antinatalism fit quite well together. So from how I've sort of learned about libertarianism and how you were explaining about it before in the intro, is it could basically be called, like you said, like I'm going to fuck the words up, but voluntarism, or consensualism.
Yeah,
And basically the idea is that, yeah, it seems like the two key principles are like non-aggression, not initiating any sort of like force on someone else, which is, where the voluntary, action should be done voluntary rather than through coercion, and non-violation of consent. So anything that happens to someone should be consented to by them. And as like an example would be the past couple of years. I won't use the V word, but the injection that has been more
Yes, all
relevant in
too well.
recent times. Exactly. So that is something that has been like much more relevant nowadays, which is like surrounding the topic of consent, right? So the those seem like the two sort of core like foundations of libertarianism, and the way and bringing it to antinatalism. So obviously antinatalism is all about being critical of the act of procreation, or creating another person, basically. And the way that I view that is that it is an initiation of force, because you're forcing someone into the world without any idea of how they're going to navigate it, how they're going to react to it. Um, you're also imposing harm on them, because everyone knows that life contains like harm and suffering, right? In many forms. But also you're imposing death on them. Like we're all going to die. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we can sort of be immortal or anything. So we're all going to die, and we're imposing death on someone, and also the process of dying, because none of us really know how we're going to die. Which it would be also interesting to maybe touch on like euthanasia and libertarianism as well, because that's quite interesting, because nowhere really in the world has sort of widespread open access to a sort of dignified way of dying. So that's another thing that's being imposed, is sort of like this process of dying, which can often be, even in like quite economically developed countries, can often be quite painful and undignified. And the final thing I'd mention is that um, like procreation and the act of creating someone is done without consent. Now, obviously, before you create someone, there is no one to be able to consent. But I don't see the fact that you can't get consent to do something as a good reason to do it. Just before I like hand over to you, I just wanted to read out. I mentioned to you that there's like a little book called A Libertarian Case for Antinatalism, and
Yeah.
there was one quote from it which I just wanted to read, because I thought it was like, it sort of sums it up in libertarian language that I wouldn't have been able to come up with. And it says, if the non-aggression principle and respect for consent are regarded as our highest moral principles, how can we justify the creation of another person, a person who does not and indeed cannot give consent to this action, and who is guaranteed to endure severe harms because of this action? How is this any better than imposing similar harms upon an existing person without consent? Um, so, yeah, I'd maybe hand over to you, and sort of, what is your sort of initial reaction to that?
So I guess there's a couple of things that I'd probably want to iron out before we get to
Mm,
that deeper philosophical question of the nature of consent. So I just want to understand your position. Like, because you've mentioned a couple of times that people are born and you're guaranteeing they're going to die and that they might suffer, etc. But let's say that you could absolutely guarantee that someone's going to have a blissful life to the bitter end. They're going to have ultimate, the highest imaginable human bliss, and then at the end of their life, they don't even know they're going to die. It's just instant, like literally 1 second to the next, they're gone. Do
mm,
you think under those circumstances, it's obviously a hypothetical,
yeah.
would that change your view on whether it's morally justifiable to kind of have that child? Does taking away essentially those those negative aspects of life, does that mean that it would mean that you wouldn't advocate for antinatalism, or would you still have the same opinion because they still can't consent, even if they're consenting? They can't consent even to a life of bliss as well as a life of pain. So does that change
Yeah.
your view on it?
So this is in the like the example you're giving. This is someone who, that like, they don't get harmed. It's basically just like
Yeah,
all
they're
good
going to be.
stuff,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's going to be
Yeah, yeah,
amazing. They're going to just live a life of
yeah.
of,
Then I
of
would have
pure bliss.
Yeah, I would have no issue with that. I would basically be indifferent to it. Like if they're not created, then like there's no one to exist to really care that they weren't created. But if they are created, like they're only going to experience good stuff. They're not going to come to any harm. So I would just be indifferent with that.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's useful to know because yeah. So basically, your concern is that that person is going to have some suffering in their life, and that you are
Mm.
guaranteeing that they will experience some level of suffering, even if they might have. Okay, but then I would say, well, doesn't that mean therefore that you would have to assume that the suffering is going to outweigh the suffering is going to outweigh the blissful experiences or the positive experiences? Isn't your assumption that that is going to be the case? Because if you think that, surely then you could take that same argument and say, well, if the balance is overall in favor of that life is good, generally, it might not be pure bliss, but let's say it's 51% bliss and 49% shit. Wouldn't that tip the scales? Do you not have to have a very pessimistic view of life to advocate for antinatalism? In that you have to think that it is net suffering.
I I don't think so, and the reason is so this get you know how I said before, sort of like there's four main, as I see it, four main arguments for antinatalism, but two of them are particularly relevant to libertarianism. So the two that are particularly relevant is what's called the consent argument, which is basically, you can't get consent from someone to create them, and then the imposition argument is that by creating someone, you impose something on them which was not imposed on them before because they didn't exist. But there are two other sort of main arguments, is the way I put it. So one of them is called the risk argument, but the other one is called, um, without using like the philosophical terms, it's basically called the asymmetry. And what you've just touched on is like what I would call the asymmetry. So basically, imagine imagine like you are with a partner, and let's say we're a gay couple and we live in a world where gay couples can have biological kids between themselves. They don't need some sort of assistive reproductive technology, right? Um and we sort of go to the doctor, and I don't know, you get your like genes checked or whatever to check that you don't have any like recessive genes or whatever that are going to fuck the kid up. So let's say we do that, and somehow you can find out that the kid you're going to create, is guaranteed like 90% bliss and 10%, is going to be bad stuff or suffering or however you want to put it. Now, in my view, and this is where the asymmetry comes in, is that it's still we still shouldn't be creating that person, because and I say this as someone who, like, I'm not like a depressive person. Like, I'm generally day to day quite optimistic. I've had like a pretty good like life compared to like most people. So the reason is that we have like no reason, as I see it, to create people for them to experience good things, right? Like, if you create someone, it is then good that they experience good things, but it doesn't make sense to create someone so they can experience good things. And I'll give you an example. Like, if I said
But
to you
wait,
that
wait,
I
sorry,
wanted,
sorry to
sorry,
interrupt you there. But like, doesn't that just contradict what you just said, where you said that if you could guarantee that they had a blissful life, that you would be okay, you wouldn't be an antinatalist? So doesn't that go against what you just said here? Because you
well,
just
no, I
you
would
just said
say,
now that even if they're going to have good experiences, they wouldn't have had those desires before they were born, and therefore it doesn't make a difference whether they're going to experience good things.
yeah,
So then surely you should be against it, i.e.
no. So
still
the
be a
difference,
antinatalist
yeah,
even if
yeah.
it's going to be pure bliss.
No, so the difference is, when I was saying it's pure bliss, I'd be indifferent, so I wouldn't care. Whereas what I'm saying is, what the asymmetry says is that we have no reason to do it. So if we go back to the pure bliss example from before, I would say the same. Like, we have no reason to create this person, but if someone does create them for whatever reason, maybe it's just a selfish desire, they want to create someone, then I don't really see any harm. But I don't think we have an active reason to create them. Does that make sense?
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Um,
Yeah. So like
yeah,
I can give an example.
I kind of see
Yeah.
your point, but then I also just think like if you're going to use the argument that that person had no desire before they were born because there is no person to have a desire
Mm.
to be born, right? Then I think that to be consistent, it would make sense to say, well, even if it is pure bliss, well, they didn't have the desire to be a person who experiences pure bliss, and therefore you would still take the antinatalist route. I don't see why that becomes basically why you're agnostic on that particular scenario, but you're not agnostic when it comes to, they might have some, good and bad times, they might have some suffering. Like, I feel like both positions should be the same. I'm not quite sure why you'd take a different position.
Let me give an example, like apply it to an example which will maybe help enlighten it. So one common example that antinatalists use is, it I would assume you'd agree that it makes no sense to say I'm going to create a child so that they can have a nice retirement. Like, do you think that that doesn't make sense, right? Because
Yeah, that doesn't make
you
sense. Yeah.
exactly. And so similarly, I would also say it doesn't make sense to create a child so that they can have good experiences. And it's the same with the happy retirement, because the only reason they need the happy retirement or they need the good experiences is because you created the need for it in the first place when you created them, right? Do you
Yeah.
follow?
So yeah, I mean, there's another strand I want to take here, but I'll let you
Mm.
finish on this. On It
Okay,
kind of
cool.
comes into something else I wanted to mention, but do you want to finish that point and then I'll bring it up because I don't want to kind of derail this line.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, so it makes no sense to me to create someone so they can have a happy retirement. But if someone is going to create someone, like obviously it's good for them to have a happy retirement. And if the only thing that person has in their life is a happy retirement and it's all bliss and like there's nothing bad going on for them, then like I don't really care either way, like if they're going to get created or not. Like sure, I think it doesn't make sense to create a desire to then like only just to so that you can fulfill it. Like that makes no sense to me. Just like don't create the desire in the first place. But if someone is going to create a desire and it's going to get 100% fulfilled, no shortages, so there's no harm done, like doesn't make sense to me. But like whatever, no harm done. I don't really care.
Okay,
That
I see. I think
yeah.
I understand that what you're saying. So basically, what you're saying is that if there were to be a desire in the ether that whatever your spirit exists in, whatever like your view you take on that is, if there is a
Mm.
desire, that desire is going to be I want to experience pure bliss. So therefore, if there's pure bliss, well, you've at least if there was a desire, you've satisfied it, right? Whereas, is that kind of what you're saying?
No, it's not necessarily that there's a desire out there sort of going around. It's that when you create someone, you know you've created a desire because like, everyone has a desire to have a nice life, right? Um, so it's not that the desire exists in some sort of weird
Ah, I get it.
ether,
Okay, okay,
ether
yeah,
region.
yeah.
It's that you are creating it in the person. So just to round off, to go back, because I was talking about you were saying how you'd have to have a pessimistic view of life and you have to assume there's more suffering than like good stuff. And I said about, well, no, I would still take the view because if you had 90% good stuff, 10% bad stuff. So to bring it back to that, so it seems to me like the only reason you would create someone for that person's sake is so that they can have a good life, which would be that 90%. But like I said before, it doesn't really make sense to create someone so they can have a good life, just like it doesn't make sense to create someone so they can have a good retirement. And so to me, that suggests that we have that 90% of good stuff gives us no reason to create the person, but the 10% of bad stuff does give us a reason not to create them. Because even though they don't exist yet, we know that when we create them, we're imposing those like bad things, that 10%, whatever it would be. Maybe they would have a really good life, but at the end of their life it would be fucking awful or something like that. Do you get what I mean? Or maybe the 10% is just sort of like evenly distributed across their life or whatever. But that is what the asymmetry is that we don't have a reason to like compelling us to create good things, but we do have a reason compelling us not to create bad things. So that is why even if someone on balance, like probably myself, would have a good life overall, what we would consider a good life, it doesn't make sense to me to create that person, and I'm still imposing harms and ultimately death on them as well.
Okay, right, yeah, yeah. I think I understand your position then. Okay, so just to draw this out because I want to try and test the boundaries of that line of thinking. So
Yeah.
you said that you would become agnostic if someone experiences basically pure unadulterated bliss in their life, right? So
Mm.
let's say that person that achieves pure unadulterated bliss for 99.9, keep them going percent of the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
But let's
And
say
then they
one
stub
day they
their
stub
toe.
their toe, right? Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say, right? And they stub their toe.
You know why I knew
Now,
you were gonna. Yeah, sorry.
go on.
No,
Yeah,
I was just
why?
gonna say, you know why I knew you were gonna say stub your toe is because you know how people say to vegans, "What if you're on a desert island?" Stubbing your
Yeah.
toe is what everyone says to
Oh, is
antinatalists.
it? Is it?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. It's
this is
like the
funny.
classic. It's like, "Oh, I stubbed my toe."
I'm the carnist of the antinatalist world coming in with all of these like normie examples. So yeah, basically in that example
Mm.
then, with pure bliss aside from stubbing a toe, would you still say, right, they stubbed the toe? No, like you weren't justified that I'm no longer agnostic on bringing that person to the world because they stubbed their toe, even though the rest of their life was pure bliss.
Yeah, so I think this one is really interesting. So if we were just talking about that person and we weren't taking into account anything in the wider world, I would, and it's just that person we're talking about, then I would say, like, yeah, there's no point bringing them into existence. And we're imposing, even though it's a tiny amount of harm, we're imposing some harm on them. And, like, yeah, there would be bliss in their life, but, like, they don't exist now to want the bliss. So I would be against creating that person. But and like here like yeah, here is the but.
But
Um
wait, sorry. Just
is
before you go on to the but you did say that if they experience pure bliss without the stotub, right, that you're agnostic on it. So
yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like, what's the difference there? I don't understand.
the introduction of harm.
I kind of think you are the introduction of harm, right? But then even if the vast majority is non-harm and it is bliss, it's only because there is a harm. Because you're basically okay. So you're basically saying like
It's
if
because of that asymmetry that I was talking about.
right. So the scales are tipped the moment there is an iota of suffering. Basically, that changes the
Yes,
moral
but
dynamic.
yeah, but here is the but, because I realize that when someone hears that, they think, oh well, that's ridiculous. That's an extreme position. You know, oh, you're just being so risk averse. Blah, blah, blah. Like, what do you live your whole life behind a sofa or something? So
Yeah.
So, and I get, like, from the outside that it looks like that, you know, because, like, being antinatalist, you have to get used to people seeing you from the outside as a fucking mentalist. But anyway, so um
It's like veganism.
yeah,
I
exactly.
can't
Like,
imagine life as a
honestly,
vegan
honestly,
antinatalist.
man, honestly, man, there's so many parallels. There's so many parallels. And when you're a vegan antinatalist, it's fucking insane. But
Yeah, well,
anyway,
I think
so
the same between vegans and libertarians, and I'm struggling to get allies on that one though.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, so maybe we can relate then on slightly different topics, but, like, we
Oh
can
yeah, yeah,
relate.
100%.
So with the whole stubbing toe thing, so yeah, if we were just talking about that person, like, I've literally got no reason to create them. Why am I creating this person? It's not like they exist in some sort of ghost fetus form and they want to be created. Like, you know, I've got no reason to create them. Why would I impose even that small amount of harm on them? But it is a tiny amount of harm. So if I did create someone who just stubbed their toe, but otherwise just blissful life, like, it's a tiny amount of harm. I haven't done something that bad. It's not like I've created a kid who gets cancer at 2 years old. Do you get what I mean? So there are degrees of harm. So I think
I
it
agree.
doesn't
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sense to, yeah, it doesn't make
But then
sense to
if
create that
yeah, sorry,
person
go on.
to me, but
Yeah,
it's
okay.
not that big a deal. Yeah.
So this is the thing though. Like I kind of feel like unless your position is that is that only pure bliss is kind of morally justifiable, right? Unless that's your position. If your position is it's a stub toe, so I don't have too much of a problem with it. Well, then we could say, well, maybe they have a generally good life, but one day they break their arm, and then you could say, well, maybe they had a generally like a really good blissful life, but they broke their arm and they had the heart broken one time, right? I kind
Mm.
of feel like once you've accepted that there is an iota of suffering which can happen, and it's still you don't have too much of a problem with it, like you're not going to have a strong opinion. Well, then we're on a sliding scale, right? It's not a binary. So now that we've moved away from it being a binary thing, that essentially it's wrong in all cases to bring someone into the world who cannot consent to their existence, right? I kind of feel like once you've accepted that there is a sliding scale there, I would say, well, either it's binary, i.e., they have to live in pure bliss, or
Mm.
it's some kind of utilitarian idea, i.e., there has to be kind of like 51% of bliss, and then it's still justifiable. And unless you can be pretty sure that person is going to have more than 50% of their life in bliss, that it's kind of wrong to have
Mm.
them. I don't see how you can be in the middle of those two. I feel like I feel like for consistency, it should be either the binary or the utilitarian kind of overall, positive versus suffering kind of concept.
Yeah, I mean, so if we're just talking in the abstract, right, then if we're just like doing some sort of like intellectual philosophical masturbation, then like I
Which
would
we
be
are.
binary.
At least I am.
So then if we're just doing like armchair philosophy, then I would be binary. But we live in the real world, and I realize that different interests and actions have to be balanced off each other. And so I do realize that, whether someone likes utilitarianism or not, like it comes into the play. Like if someone said to me tomorrow that Uganda is gonna get like a nuclear bomb dropped on it unless I have a kid, like I'm fucking having the kid. Do you get what I mean? So like I'm not. I don't think antinatalists. I think we should be like strong and principled in like our arguments and when we talk to people, just like vegans should be. But I think we should also be pragmatic as well. Um, and I think like one of the examples, and this is a whole nother subject where we maybe don't have to get into, but I'll just mention it. But like one of the big conversations that goes on in antinatalist worlds, and it also goes on in vegan worlds, it's somewhere where antinatalists and vegans overlap a lot. And I don't know how much like exposure you've had to this, is about like wild animal suffering. So have you sort of like explored that topic
Yeah,
a lot?
I think I know where you're going with it. Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of vegans, they actually just talk about domesticated animals, and they don't sort of pay much attention to the animals in the wild, which, I think is unfortunate. But how it enters the conversation with antinatalism is that, obviously, um in a perfect world, antinatalists would essentially want humans not to exist, right? Because there's no victims to come into existence. But if let's say antinatalism like caught on like wildfire, and everyone subscribed up to it, and humans did go extinct in like a few generations time or whatever, I actually think for pragmatic reasons, like if we're just talking like philosophical masturbation, then like yeah, that's great. But in pragmatic terms, actually, if humans go extinct, we're leaving wild animals behind, and like they're fucking like in an awful situation. And maybe with the knowledge and the technology that humans have, we may get to a point where we can actually significantly help them. Now we have to be careful about that, obviously, but we could get to a point where we can help them. But if antinatalism had its way, humans would be out there before we could do that. So I think utilitarianism and pragmatism does come into antinatalism. So for me personally, I see no good reason for me to procreate. So I've had a vasectomy, like I can't have a kid now, right? Which I think is a good thing, because even if I regret it and I do want to have a kid, well, then I can help a kid that already exists and adopt, right? Rather than force someone else into the world.
Yeah, that's commendable.
Yeah, but that's for me personally. That's me taking a hard line for me personally. If I'm talking about the bigger picture, humanity as a whole, do I think humans should go extinct? I don't think it would be the best idea. Which maybe seems ridiculous to someone who's heard my me explain antinatalism, but I think for practical reasons, if antinatalism was just carried out to the book, it would actually cause more harm than good. Because I think humans can stay around and help the other animals on this planet that are in an awful situation. Does that answer your question about how pragmatism comes into it?
So basically, I do want to I want to get onto this point that you've just made, basically about the
Yeah.
idea of that, like you don't want human species to basically be extinct. That you still think there's a place for, you want humans for some benefit here on Earth, right? So I do want to go into that whole idea. But first of all, I just want to address the thing that I don't think we've ironed out yet, which is that
Okay.
you accepted that you kind of, that this is kind of a sliding scale in terms of the moral justification, or the, yeah, I guess I don't know whether that's the right word, but whatever, moral justification, you know what I mean by that, for having kids, is that like, depending on the amount of suffering versus bliss, it seems like you accept that there is that there is a degree there to which, if it's mostly bliss. Now I would say, like, the natural point for that is to say, well, if they're having more positive experiences than suffering, and you weigh, you can kind of weigh it up however you choose to weigh it up. But if you accept that that is a sliding scale, and that if people do have these generally positive experiences, that the more positive experiences versus negative that you have, that you're more okay with it and you're less antinatalist, then doesn't it posit doesn't the natural conclusion of that end up in, well, it's therefore you have to have a generally negative view of someone's life, or you have to be able to reasonably predict they're going to have an overall bad life to be antinatalist? I don't see how you can be anywhere in between either like 51%, 49% on the kind of bliss to suffering rate, or it's pure blissfulness. I kind of feel like if you're going to be pragmatic, and you use the word pragmatic there, well, then isn't the pragmatic level, if they're having a generally positive life, that it's justified in your ethical framework?
When you say justified, what is justifying it?
Essentially, it's justified in bringing a life into the world. I'm not sure how you would term that, but that's kind of the best I got right now.
Yeah. So the reason I ask is because, do you mean it's justified as in it's justified just because they want to? Because
well, it's justified for that individual who's been brought in, i.e., that you've not committed a harmful act upon the person by bringing them in the world, or an act, because essentially this is why I brought up before, and I gave you the example of the pure bliss experience, because I think that if you say that it's still wrong in the pure bliss experience, and you say, because then you're saying, well, it doesn't matter if it's pure bliss, it's non-consensual, right? Essentially what I'm saying is that you, if it's still wrong, even if someone enjoys something, but it's still non-consensual, right? I kind of understand that point. Because you could say, well, yeah, like someone could have enjoyment from something that I do to them, but they haven't consented to it, right? Now, so that will be a binary, right? And then if you've got the other thing where you're saying, well, if they have generally a good experience of it, essentially, I'm still trying to figure out that if it's not a binary, and you accept that if someone has generally good experiences, but there is some bad experience, that it's a sliding scale, why don't you end up at, well, if life is generally positive, then I support that I'm not an antinatalist? Why is that not the position that you end up in? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. So with the generally positive, so could I take generally positive to mean something like, obviously you don't know me, but could I take something to generally positive to mean something like my life, like a general decent life in the UK, that I'm sure you can imagine what that's like? You live near a supermarket, you have, your food requirements met, maybe occasionally you get a bit too drunk and throw up, and that's not nice, but do you get what I mean? Is that what you generally mean by a good life? Like a generally good life?
I would say a generally good life is like a life that, like, let's say yeah, I mean, it's hard to define what a generally good life is, because you can compare a good life to a bad life, but you can't really compare a good life to non-existence, right? So that's kind of the paradigm. Like, it might be we might be kind of chasing our tail a little bit with this, but I would say that, like, so if someone described themselves as having a good life, if someone just said, my life is generally good, I have more positive experiences, it's a subjective thing, but if they said, I'm having more positive experiences than I am negative, for that person, do you think that they're, like you've said yourself, you have a generally good life, you don't have a bad life, etc. So do you accept that in your position, you're comfortable with the fact that you were brought into this world without, some kind of impossible consent that you can't give as a non-existing human? Do in your case, do you think, I'm kind of glad I'm here?
Short answer is no. So just to preface this whole thing, just to start it off, like, I don't like berate my parents or anything like that. Like, I'm like a reasonably normal human being, and I know that normal actually in the world we live in probably isn't a good thing. So a good normal, like, I'm sort of like, I'm reasonable. So I'm not going to go around like berating my parents. Like, they didn't think about the full consequences of their actions. But no, I don't think it was a good thing that I was like created. I recognize that, given that I was like, I'm in like a definitely, I'm top of the, like, near the top of the range in terms of everyone that's ever existed and everyone who exists now. Like, I'm pretty fucking lucky. Given that I was created, I'm pretty fucking lucky with the life I have. But if I was never created, like, I wouldn't miss the life I have, and would have been spared with all the bad shit that's gone on. So just to give one example, and like honestly, I'm not using like this example as like a way to drop like a sympathy bomb in there, and like so you say whatever you want to say for the rest of the conversation, but like just one example is like around like 5-6 years ago, like my granddad got cancer, and I handled it like quite badly, and that's just like one thing in my life that I've had to deal with, which most people deal with. Most people have a loved one who they care about deeply die, whilst they're still alive, and it fucking sucks for them. And that's just one thing that most people who judge themselves to have a generally good life have to deal with. And I would have been spared that if I was never created, amongst all the other things, right? And I'm only 25. I don't know how the rest of my life's going to go. 1 in 3 people in the UK get cancer. I wouldn't wish cancer on someone, but if I created a kid, as the statistics go, I would be rolling a 1 in 3 dice of them getting cancer. Like, if I could point my finger at you and say, I could give you 1 in 3 chance of cancer, and like boom, I just sort of transmit 1 in 3 chance of cancer to you now as someone who already exists. That's a dick move, right? I think everyone would agree with that. But that's what I'm doing when I create someone, and I'm not giving them any benefits, because sure, they might end up having a life they say is good, but they never wanted that in the first place. They never existed to want it. And the only reason they want a good life is because I instilled that in them when I created them, if you get what I mean. It's the whole sort of nice retirement thing again. So that, I think, is why a life that is generally defined as good, which I think I have, and like a lot of people in the UK will have, because we're a relatively prosperous country, I still think those lives are bad to bring into existence. And, I brought up the example of cancer, or bereavement from losing a loved one. Those are literally just 2 ways that people can suffer. Like, there are so many ways: drug addiction, oppression from the government, medication going wrong, a genetic disease. I could go on and on and on. And yeah, but I can back over to you. If that
Yeah,
answers your
so
question, please let me know if I
yeah,
haven't answered your question.
it kind of does. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot that I want to go into about that, but I almost feel
Yeah.
like this is going to kind of be sitting at a level above the other conversation that we were having. So it does kind of answer my question really about the those net trade offs and stuff that we're talking about. It sounds like basically you are in it's not a 51% 49% thing. It's also not a binary thing, but that generally you are, because I guess it sounds like maybe for instance with these experiences you're talking about, you're weighting them like, okay, well, you might get cancer and stuff, and you're kind of like giving them a certain amount of weighting in terms of how much suffering that is. I still feel like you are performing a calculation though on how much suffering versus positive experience someone has, right? Like, even if you're using more extreme examples of suffering, there's still a calculation which is taking place
Mm.
there. So if there is a
Yeah.
calculation taking place, then then we just need to basically, you can just ask someone, is your life generally positive? And if they say, yeah, it's generally positive, then it's justified for that person, right? Even if there is
Well,
these risks.
yeah. Let me a quick note on the calculation thing. So I'm saying that calculation as someone who exists. So I exist, you exist, obviously. Like, once we exist, like, the good things in life, they really matter. So, the good things in life, the people who exist, we should try and accrue good things in life as much as we can, and have good, decent lives, be kind to one another, all these sorts of things, try and avoid suffering as much as we can, grow as a person, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. But that's when you exist, and those are the calculations that you make once you exist. When you're deciding whether to create someone else, I think it's a completely different calculation. In fact, I don't really think it's much of a calculation at all when you're talking about that person, because, as I said before, with the asymmetry, you're not making a calculation any longer with the goods and the bads, because, like I said before, it makes no sense to create someone for the goods, like it makes no sense to create someone for the nice retirement. And so you don't really need to consider the good stuff for them, because there's no one to want the good stuff. But you do
Yep.
need to take into account. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no. Well, but then again, like like you just said, you don't really take consideration of the good stuff because you're comparing it to non-existence. So therefore, why not also be against the purely blissful experience, i.e., back to that binary again? This is what I keep coming back to: is that if you are
Mm.
discounting the propensity for someone to have good experience, why not discount the guarantee of good experience in that
Yeah,
hypothetical? Why not just
because
say, well, it's still, they can't consent to it, they're non-existing, they don't have the desire for those good experiences, so why not be
yeah.
against it as a blanket?
But so, with the example of someone who just has a purely blissful life, I am discounting the bliss, because if I wasn't discounting it, I would want to bring them into existence. But given that I'm discounting it, and I think that bringing them into existence is utterly pointless and useless, and it means nothing, and it does nothing, it achieves nothing, I'm just indifferent to it. I would be against it if it causes harm. But the example that you've given, you explicitly said there is no harm. So I'm just indifferent. So I think maybe that's where we were getting confused.
But
Like
what?
my
But then
sorry.
why are you indifferent? But then why are you indifferent? Because again, like, you're discounting the positive. So surely, if your default is we shouldn't bring someone into the world because there's no consent that can be kind of provided for that person to, they can't consent to
But
their own existence. Then why are you indifferent? Why are you not still
mm,
against?
well, because consent for me is really, at least when it comes to procreation, consent is really only an issue when you're imposing harm on someone.
Okay, okay, yeah, but then we're back to, like, if there is some harm, then but it's generally good, even if there is some harm. Like, back to the stub your toe issue. We kind of, like once you've entered
Yeah, but
that,
like I said,
but you,
I would be against that. But it would
okay,
just be a
right, yeah,
very, it would just, I wouldn't be as strongly against it, if you get what I mean. It's like, I'm against killing animals for food, and I'm also against, having keeping animals in petting zoos, but I'm more against killing animals for food because it does more harm. But I'm against both of them. But I think one is a bigger harm than the other one, if you get what I mean.
okay, and yeah, fine, fine. So it's a sliding scale, basically. It is a sliding scale.
Yeah, it's binary and a sliding scale. So it's binary in that I'm against imposing harm on someone when it comes to procreation in the abstract, but I realize that we don't live in the abstract. And so once we get to the fact that if you're going to create someone and you're going to impose harm on them, the amount of harm causes a sliding scale, if you get what I mean. So, like, if I was given two cases, stub your toe or just don't create someone, I would do don't create someone. But if you give me stub your toe or they're killed in a fucking genocide, then I'd go for stub your toe. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
do, I do get what you mean. I do get what you mean, but you're still performing value judgments. So if you're performing value judgments, right, then we're into the subjective. And then I could say, well, my value judgment is that most people like generally enjoy their lives. So my value judgment is that there is no, I performed just by my own subjective ideas, but I've essentially performed the same calculation you have. But because we can't actually define value, or define positive,
Mm,
negative, these kind of things, they're somewhat abstract. But I'm performing similar calculations and saying, well, people
mm.
have generally positive lives, so why doesn't this just come down to a completely subjective question in the end?
So I would say three things to that, and I'm gonna forget some of them. So, um, and I've actually fucking forgotten all of them now. So, when can you repeat what you said, and it will trigger my memory?
Yeah, so
It
so
was
I
because I had
basically was
so many
talking
things
about, you're
buzzing around.
performing value judgments when you accept that there's a difference between stubbing the toe and dying in a genocide. You're accepting that one is worse than the other, but in both cases you're saying go for non-existence. That's fine, but then you are accepting. Actually, maybe I've answered my own question here. Maybe I've answered my own question. You're essentially saying that the once someone has been born, there's various kind of sliding scales on how against it you are, but you are, as a binary, against it in all cases when there is an iota of suffering, and then you're indifferent
Yeah.
if there is basically pure bliss. In that case, you have an indifferent approach.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, basically you got it. But I just want to say something about, because you know how you said, if you ask someone today and they say, they had a good life and they're generally glad they were born. I actually did a reaction video literally today. I published it. It's like 10 minutes long, reacting to a philosopher who made this argument. And there's a few things that I would say about that, because it is true. Like, if you surveyed the world, um, like, most people would probably say that they were glad to have been born. Even people who are in like shit situations or have been, through cancer or something like that, and survived it. And there are a few things that I would say about that. The first one is, just because you've said that you are glad to be born, and let's say you've gone through some hardship and you're like, I dealt with the hardship and it was fine and I'm glad that I have the happy things. Okay, well, that's good for you, but I don't think that justifies you imposing a hardship on someone else just because you could get over it. You don't know they will be able to. Another thing I would say is that the fourth argument that I mentioned before, which I haven't really elaborated on for antinatalism, is called the risk argument. And basically, this is just the idea that when you're creating someone, like, sure, there are loads of people who have sort of like middle of the range average lives, which, some good, some bad. But there are some people who have just like unimaginably bad lives. So these are people who get brain cancer and they have like convulsions and bite through their tongue, or these are children who are born and are in a cancer ward within the first couple of years of their life, or these are people with depression, stuff like that. The risk argument is basically saying, you see those people, like, when you create someone, you don't know whether the person you create is going to be one of those people or not. So, like, yeah, it's all fun and games that there are loads of people out there with like what we could call average or decent lives. But just because there's that large group of people there, that isn't a justification for you as an individual to take the risk on someone else's behalf as to whether they're going to be in that group or in the smaller, okay, but still group that has really bad lives. And so the risk argument basically says, who am I and who are you, or who is anyone to roll that dice on behalf of someone else when they literally don't exist? Like, they're not in any risk of danger. It's not like you're saving them from somewhere but taking a risk at the same time. You're literally taking them. Well, they're not them. They just don't exist. You're literally taking non-existence and creating the risk for these horrible things out of nothing. Um, and sorry, do you want to go, or can I say one more thing?
Yeah, if you want to keep going, keep going. Yeah.
There was one final thing I was going to say, which was one of the main points I said in the video I released today, which is um, the when people say that they're glad to be alive, and I used to say this, like, I used to be one of those people. And, like, don't get me wrong, I don't wake up every day going, oh, I exist again. Like, do you get what I mean? Like, I'm not one of those people. But when people say they're glad to be alive and they were glad they were born, I think they're saying that because they're not really fully accurately thinking about the counterfactual situation where they were never born. What they're thinking about is, I enjoy what's happening right now, and it would suck if it ended, or if it would suck if I missed out on this. And so I don't want to have not been born, because then I miss out on this. But they're not fully realizing that if they were never born, they would literally not exist to even know that they've missed out on it, or they wouldn't exist to even desire that life. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I do, and I think this is something which I kind of did want to get into. I've kind of like in my mind bookmarked the stuff about still having humans on Earth and looking after the wild
Mm.
animals thing, but I kind of feel like maybe we should leave that one for now because I want to continue with
Yeah,
this thought.
we
But
can have
maybe
another conversation another time if you
yeah,
want. It's like,
that'd be good because I didn't understand your point on that, but probably rather than
yeah,
opening up a whole new can of worms with that and going
yeah,
back to
that's
it,
cool.
let's bookmark it and stick with what you just said. So here's the thing, like I think I understand like the point of saying, oh well, someone can't consent to their own existence and all the rest of it. So like, let's take, like, I'm not going to kind of continue with the line about the kind of net suffering, net positive experience stuff because we've kind of hashed it out already. But when it comes to this idea of like people, that someone can't consent to being born and stuff like that, well, that's true, but also, can you commit a rights violation against someone who is non-existent? Do you know what I mean? Like that, there's also just the fact that, well, if that person doesn't exist, like, does it make any rational sense to consider their rights? I almost feel like we're, by even considering a rights framework for a non-existent being, is kind
Mm.
of, that's almost getting into religious territory in itself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So this was actually something that I was thinking of today for a completely unrelated reason. I can't remember what the reason was. And I think it's a matter of how you say it. So some people, um, so I'm assuming when you say the rights violation, you're talking about like violating consent, that sort of
Yeah, the consent
thing, right?
to being born, basically.
Yeah. So the way that some people struggle to get their head around it, and I can understand why, because we're really not used to thinking about non existence. We're always dealing with things that exist or that will exist in the future, right? So often, and like I struggle with as well, like everyone does. Um, so with the whole rights violation, so it is often said, like people bring this up with antinatalists, like you just have, is that, you know, it seems odd to talk about rights violations when we're talking about someone who doesn't exist, right? Because there is no one to exist to be violated. The way that I would frame it is not like you're violating the right of someone who doesn't exist, because you're not, like they don't exist to have any rights. But procreation, creating someone, birth, requires a rights violation inherent in it. So you're not violating someone's right who doesn't exist, but the second that you create someone, that requires a rights violation. And so even though there isn't someone who exists now to be violated, if you know, if you take this action, you know that a right will be violated in the future in 9 months. It's basically the same thing to me. Do you get what I mean? It's the same thing as violating someone's right by pressing a button and something happening to them. Who, if someone already exists and I press a button and in 9 months' time their right gets violated, to me that seems the exact same thing as doing that to someone who doesn't exist. If you get what I mean.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. I see where you're going with that. It's like, you know, that that person will exist by the nature of bringing them into the
Exactly.
world.
Yeah.
So
So it's
you
like
can still consider their, essentially their future rights, because you're performing the action which is going to bring them into existence. Okay, I kind of get that.
exactly, yeah.
I mean,
Because I think, sorry.
yeah. Well, this is where we're going to get into the. This is where we're definitely going to get into the spiritual realm. I think ultimately this question is then going to come down to, because I had this conversation actually with someone on my podcast. I can't remember which episode it was, but I've been having these thoughts about, just the nature of, like, being born and existence and all the rest of it. And
Mm,
I think there's two ways you can look at life, right? Like, one is that, you kind of come into this world like completely by accident. It's just, sperm meets the egg, bam, your consciousness comes into existence and stuff. And the other is that maybe I don't really know what one is before one is born, like whether you're merged with some kind of unified consciousness or something. I'm kind of spiritual on this. So I don't have like, I don't believe that that there is nothing that can, maybe you can't describe it as you or whatever, but I kind of believe there is, when you're born, basically. I don't think it's like you're just brought into this world in an act of, it's not like you're just like put in this prison of a universe that's like, here you are. I kind
mm,
of believe, and I have no ability to prove it, so it's not really something worth argumentation. I accept that it's more of an esoteric idea that
yeah.
that, like, I think that if you believe that basically when you come into this world, it's like, oh, I was just forced here. Fuck, like I didn't, like I didn't ask to be here, and now I'm suddenly here. I believe more that there is some reason that you're born in, and that you actually choose to do it. Like, I don't believe that you can be just brought into this world by some act of, kind of force against the will of whatever your spirit is before you're born. But I kind of, and I know that I sound maybe like some of the religious people, like, when you talk to about like
Woo
veganism
woo,
and stuff, and
I
they're like,
think
oh,
is the
well,
technical term.
yeah, 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 woo woo and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think that you either are woo woo and you believe that there is something there that means that you in
Mm,
some way consent to your own existence, or you believe that you're just dragged into this world against your will, and that, that's it. Like, you suddenly just born, you're like, fuck, I didn't want to be here. Now, I kind of believe that latter view has to be adopted in order to kind of subscribe to antinatalism. You have to believe that there is no such thing in the ether where you kind of like, your soul or whatever was yearning to be born in some way. And I guess that like ultimately that like my belief is that there is something there. And it's not necessarily a religious belief. Well, let me throw that over to you, by the way, just before I kind of like go like
Yeah.
run on about it.
So, like, just for like full disclosure, my personal beliefs, like, I don't have any beliefs that I think people would term as like spiritual. Like, I don't believe that there is anything like a soul or a spirit or anything. Like, I don't say that people who believe that are wrong. I just haven't seen like evidence that has like persuaded me. But like honestly, in the past couple of years, I've been more open to spiritual things. I think I used to be a bit bigoted, like in like my younger years, and like now I've become more sort of like open to it. Like I don't, swallow everything, but I definitely lend more of an ear to that sort of stuff. Um, but yeah, I'm definitely more of the latter person. So like I wouldn't describe it as like we get pulled here kicking and screaming, because like not everyone does, like some people do enjoy their lives, and I wouldn't try to characterize their lives as kicking and screaming, because I think that's disingenuous. But some people are brought here kicking and screaming, not
But I'm not even
everyone.
talking necessarily about any moment after they're born. I'm talking more about just the nature of one coming into existence. I kind of think you either believe that you're kind of like thrust into this world against your will, i.e., you had no existence before. Here's your existence. Bam, the light's been turned on. My belief more is that there was something there before. It's not like
Okay.
you're a human or even anything that I could necessarily describe, but you are part of some kind of consciousness which has, like, by its very nature of has to consent to, not consent. It's not like you're sat down at a table and like, hey, do you want to be born?
Yeah.
But that there is some kind of like there's some mechanic there which brings you into existence, which is not just you being kind of like forced, essentially, by
Yeah.
your
Okay.
parents into the world.
So
And I have no, it's
yeah.
impossible to prove it. It's just a belief that I hold about it. Because otherwise, I think
Yeah.
the alternative seemed kind of dark to me. That it's like this just this big prism which you can be thrust in at any time and you can suddenly exist in at
Okay,
any
so
time. Yeah.
here's a question. So the way you just said it there is that the alternative seems kind of dark to you. Now, do you believe what you believe because you think it's true, or because you prefer it over the alternative?
I believe it because I think it's true. So yeah, like that is my honest belief. Obviously, you could say,
Mm.
ah, well, you're just saying that because like it
Because
makes
you
sense, and
finally
you we
met
have.
someone who you have this conversation with, and it's the upper hand or whatever.
Well, no, I mean, just like that. Essentially, you could always argue that someone has the beliefs that they do because it serves them. Because the alternative, it's kind of like when people say, about like a conspiracy theory or something, and it's like someone would say, "Oh, well, is the reason that you believe this because because you want to get away from the scariness of life or whatever?" And people say, "Oh, well, no, it's not." But then you go, "Well, how can you prove that it is or isn't?" We have the beliefs that we do, and you could argue, well, my beliefs may be clouded by the nature of
Mm.
the world, and my fears and all the other stuff. I don't know. I would say this. Like, have you ever tried psychedelics?
No, no, but it's I want to, like I want to, and I want to soon, and it's a whole like topic area that I'm like super interested in.
Yeah, I would suggest that you try psychedelics. I mean, I don't want to be like just pushing drugs on your podcast or whatever, but I mean, for me, it was transformational in the way that I
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
saw the nature of my own existence. And I've had some pretty wild out
Mm,
that kind of spirits, like, experiences basically that are, they're impossible to describe, having not done them. But I think that that has informed a lot of the way that I feel about, like, the nature of my own existence and stuff.
mm,
And personally, I found it to be very transformational. So I would be interested to know if after having psychedelic experiences, whether you still subscribe to antinatalism, or whether
mm.
having that kind of experience might get you to think differently about the nature of one's own existence.
Okay, so I got a couple of things to say. First one is I will definitely um take uh I'll drop 20 grams of mushrooms, and then we can have another conversation, and it will be one hell of a trip. No, I mean, like, I'm being like
Sounds good.
facetious, but I'm totally up for that. Like, so just to demonstrate how close I am to having it. Like, I have magic mushrooms with me now. I just haven't taken them. I'm waiting for the right moment. So like I'm very interested in this topic, and I'm very close to like getting practical experience and exploring with them. So I'd be like super interested. We can have like another conversation about the wild animal stuff, and we can even have another one about like, you know, antinatalist has a trip, and you know what happens next or whatever. That I'd be
Yeah,
100% up for that
100%. Yeah,
conversation.
yeah. That would be
Um,
great. Yeah, I'd be really interested to know how that goes for you.
yeah. Well, I'd be 100% down for that. The other thing is, so I do want to like stay on the topic of like this sort of spiritual realm for a bit, but then after, I don't want us to lose sight of the original conversation. So I want to come back to libertarianism itself,
Sure.
um, like after we've spoken about this. So with the spiritual stuff, it's somewhat hard to have a conversation on that level about antinatalism without kind of knowing the specifics of what someone believes about what happens before someone exists. And I'm not saying that to imply that, you know, what you're saying is wrong, because obviously you maybe believe that we do exist in some kind of way before we exist, if you get what I mean, like before birth, basically. Um, and so it's kind of hard because like obviously some religions, they have like reincarnation, so they believe that there is like some spirit that does inhabit, and we are basically like a flesh suit basically for the soul or the spirit or whatever. So with that sort of thing and antinatalism, it it kind of depends on if someone believes the soul or the spirit that they think inhabits the body can suffer, or if it's just some sort of like thing that just sort of floats around and it doesn't really feel anything, and it just sort of then sort of wanders into a life or something. Because yeah, it's so if like the if you believe that like the soul or the spirit can't suffer, then I would say like don't put them in a position where they can by like putting them into like a person, if you get what I mean. But you know, if you believe that um some sort of spirit or soul exists um before, you know, someone is born, it really depends what you think the character of that existence is before. Because if they're existing in hell and we're saving them from hell by creating someone, then, you know, maybe I would even be in favor of having kids then, because like we're saving people from hell. But I would assume you don't think that souls are in hell and then are brought into this existence. Like what do you think it's like before birth, if that's a coherent question?
No, yeah, definitely. I think that actually does kind of get to the core of it. You have to have some kind of belief on what that is. I guess the best way that I would describe it, and I think this is kind of informed like generally by my I don't know. I guess just through going through life, but also like through psychedelic experiences, have definitely kind of given me what I feel is like a greater insight into the nature of like existence and stuff. And I think that what I would say is like life for me, you know, what we are before it's I kind of believe that there is some kind of unified consciousness there that we're all like an individual expression of. So like everyone living and probably all the animals and everything, you know, that's any kind of consciousness that exists in the planet is all just like it's almost just like a single expression of some kind of greater consciousness. The best way that I've heard this described, have you ever listened to Alan Watts, the philosopher?
Yeah, so I know who he is. I thought you were going to bring up Terence McKenna, but I know,
I like
yeah,
Terence McKenna too, but Alan Watts I think has expressed
yeah,
this in the best way, and he basically said that he describes humanity as almost like you imagine a spider web, and the spider web has like you know dew on it, like you know on a kind of like on a morning in the
yeah,
spring or
yeah.
whatever, and it's got dew, and like each of these little droplets is on the spider web, and it's reflecting all of the other droplets right on the web, and if you change one of them, right, all of the others change because they're reflecting that individual one. So, right, you have these individual expressions, but by the nature of one changing, like all the others kind of have to by default change as well. So, like one thing affects everything else, right?
Mm,
And I think that that is a really good analogy for how I see life. So, like, I believe that like individual people are like an individual expression of a greater consciousness, but you change like one person, it changes the whole universe. Like we're all kind of connected to this kind of like into this ether somehow. So before we're born, like you might not be the, like a physical like node for this whole thing, but I still believe there is some kind of like a spiritual aspect that you're a part of, that you're still a part of everything. And that when you come into the world, I still believe that there is a purpose being served there somewhere. I don't necessarily go too far down the religious path, although I do
Yeah.
think that that religious like ways of looking at this. I don't kind of like throw them out or anything, but I believe that like there's something to do with being born that allows you to kind of experience certain things, which allows you to transcend on a more spiritual level, right? So like you have to kind of become, in order to experience oneness, you have to experience separation. So it's like you have to come from the oneness into the separate state, and then you have to kind of like live this life, and through that, like through transcending through life itself, like that you go back into the oneness somehow. And yeah, again, like I think that this is kind of like how I feel about the world from not, yeah, I mean, generally like having psychedelic experiences where it's almost like everything is this kind of very, it's like your life is kind of like this fractal, that you kind of like, you're here, but like you're kind of connected to everything. And yeah, I know that all of this probably sounds crazy to, either someone who's just not spiritual, or I think that people, if they've had a pretty good dose of psychedelics, would kind of know where I'm coming from here. And I guess like not all of it is from that. Some of it is just like my general like beliefs about the world, having no other. Everyone has to have some belief, right? Because even for yourself as like a antinatalist, or for an atheist, or whatever. I'm
Mhm.
presuming you are atheist as well, right? Like it
Yeah,
has to follow,
yeah.
right? So like but
Although
even to have that position. Oh,
there are
there are.
religious antinatalists. Yeah, there are like
Wow.
there's like a strong sect of Christian antinatalism, and just to quickly explain it, so they basically think we shouldn't create people because if you create someone, there's the chance they'll go to hell, and that is fucking eternal torture. So you just shouldn't take that chance. Is their logic?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Actually, I can see that why that would follow if you believe in hell and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess like I don't know. Maybe fill me in, because I'm kind of my
Yeah. So
my. It's
basically, I
difficult to,
think
really explain out these topics when ultimately it is totally a theory. But essentially, what I'm getting at here is like with with any view, even if you take a view that like existence just comes into being, and then it goes into nothingness at the end, that's still in itself inexplicable by the mechanics of how we live our day-to-day lives, and
mm,
how we know matter to operate and the universe to operate. Like everything is inexplicable. Atheism is just as inexplicable as theism, in my view. Like, because once you get to a certain level and you're talking about non-existence, and non-existence, like it's impossible for us to really get to the root of that. So you can have a religious view on it, or a spiritual view, and you can have an atheist view, but you're all just kind of, everyone is ultimately grabbing at straws, because we fundamentally don't know, because
mm,
non-existence as a concept makes no sense to us. What is non-existence? You know what I mean? Like this
yeah.
all does get to the core of the question, I think.
So there's two things I would say. The first one is just really quick about atheism. So I just want to be clear. So when I say I'm an atheist, I don't believe that there's no God. I just basically I'm like, so I'm basically what people say agnostic, but I think atheist is actually the accurate term. But when people hear atheist, they think you're saying there's no God. I just literally don't know. So I like reserve judgment. So I feel
Right.
like,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, people are clasping at straws, both like people who think there's no God and people who think there's a God. I just haven't clasped yet because I don't see any straws to clasp, if that makes sense. Um, but I agree with you about like the non-existence and stuff, and how, you know, it's hard. We don't fully understand consciousness, and so it is hard to, because essentially what antinatalism is basically don't create consciousness, because we're not against bacteria replicating, because as far as we're aware now, they're not conscious, right? So it's not about new life being created. It's about conscious life specifically, because conscious life is the only life that we're aware of that can suffer, and the key is the suffering. So I do get what you mean about how, you know, as a species, even our most intelligent minds have not been able to get to the point where we can fully understand consciousness and all of this sort of stuff. But what I try to do is, when I get to that point in a conversation with people, which is I think where we've got to now, is I try to take it back to basics, and down to earth sort of common sense stuff, things we know about reality, like things like I said before, like in the UK, 1 in 3 people will get cancer. It's an awful thing. The 15th leading cause of death is suicide. And if you use that as a rough metric of people who wish they never were born, then that's the 15th leading cause of death. And that's if different cancers are split up. So if you merge all cancer deaths together, suicide is probably like seventh or eighth leading cause of death in the world, right? So it's not insignificant. And if we think about these real world things, I think it brings more sort of like um it brings more vividness to the conversation about we can have these like high level conversations about, oh well, what is it before birth, and stuff like that, and spirituality and stuff. And I think those are valid conversations to have, maybe in like a seminar room. But when we're talking about the real world, and it's like, sure, we don't know what happens before we're born, but like c- can it be worse than this current situation? Like 1 in 3 chance of cancer. Like before we're born, can a soul get cancer? Do you get what I mean? This sort of stuff. Can a
Well, yeah,
soul
but
commit
I think
suicide?
it can be, because I think that you could argue from obviously a spiritual perspective, you could argue that like by having no children, right? Like we all stop procreating, that you deny the opportunity, if there is a kind of a spiritual realm there which needs to be expressed in an individual form for someone to actually
Mm,
have self-actualization and to have kind of to experience um enlightenment or whatever, like however you want to term that, the experience of going through life and then experiencing the thing that comes after that or whatever. You could say, well, having no children is maintaining kind of spiritual nothingness, maintaining a kind of spiritual malaise in the universe of whatever does exist isn't able to
mm,
express itself. There's no movement, there's no nothing. If no one procreates, there is no movement in the universe. There is like all existence ceases. And so I think that like if you believe that like existence generally is a good thing, that like and you might not, right? Like you might not as an antinatalist, but I kind of think that you could make an argument, and I would make the argument just based on my beliefs of spirituality and stuff, that nobody having kids denies the opportunity for whatever your soul or spirit or whatever is. Yes, you might not have cancer, you might not have this, that, or the other, but through the act of existing and being born and into a human or whatever, going through life, that gives you the opportunity to transcend. Like transcendence can only come from a physical form, because there can be no transcendence when you're already in the transcended form, right? So it's almost like I think that this is an experience that the soul has to go through, even with suffering and stuff. And I wouldn't even necessarily say that all suffering is bad, because suffering normally gives people the
yeah, I
opportunity
agree
to
with you.
transcend.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I about not all suffering is bad. I agree with you that once you exist, suffering can bestow benefits. But what I would say is that's not a reason to create someone, because they never need the benefits before you create them. But going back to,
But how do you know? Because that's the
oh,
thing.
sorry.
Because how do you know that? How do you know that there is no? How do you know that the act of like because for instance in my belief, like you come into the life, you try to
Mm,
ascend spiritually as best you can, but then I believe that there's ways that you can access it, like psychedelics, in my opinion, that's a way to access this oneness that seems to be like connected to us, and we don't have normal access in our brain. But also probably through the process of death, and through the process of aging, through the process of big life events, things like having loved ones die, or having children, or things like that. I kind of think that there is a spiritual process taking place there. Like if we're not here for spiritual progress and to be spiritually enlightened, what's the point in any existence? So then I kind of think, well,
that's what I would
my
say.
belief. Yeah, you would,
Like,
right?
what
So
is the point in any existence? Like, I don't think there is any point to it. Like, I think we exist. I don't know why we exist. Like, we could exist for the reasons you're saying. I just don't know. Like, we could exist because of Allah, or the flying spaghetti monster, or some sort of unicorn princess. Like, and I'm not saying that to take the piss, but like,
no, I don't.
I just I just don't know why we're here. Like, I don't I there's no obvious purpose or reason for us being here, but I know that we're here. And I look around me and survey reality and see that like some awful fucked up shit happens to people, and I don't want to put someone else in the position where that could happen to them. Um, I think we may somewhat reach an impasse in the spirituality thing, because we just have fundamental different beliefs about what is like pre-birth like. The only thing that I would say, which you're welcome to respond to, or we can just go back onto the libertarian stuff. Um, the last thing I would say, I think, is just like, it seems like to so we have like we have something we know, right? Like we know that when you create someone, there is the risk that they're going to hate their life, commit suicide. There is the risk that they're going to get brain cancer. There is the risk they're going to get hit by a car, end up in a hospital, and have lasting pain for the rest of their life. Like, these are like hard facts and possibilities that we know. And it seems like kind of shaky ground to point to some sort of theory or idea that we don't know about pre-existence, and use that as a justification for imposing all of the hard stuff that we do know could happen to someone. If you get what I mean, it seems like to impose that sort of hard stuff on someone, we have to have pretty good evidence that we're like saving them from some sort of spiritually deprived being. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I get completely what you mean, and yeah, I think that it ultimately, yeah, it is an impasse. I think that it comes into the question, but I think that do you agree though that like antinatalism, unlike veganism,
Mm.
it is necessary, ultimately it is predicated upon upon one's like spiritual beliefs, right? Like, because the difference with veganism, for instance, right, is that with veganism you can take other people's pre-existing morals and the way they live their life in other ways, and you can say, well, you're
Mm.
acting in contradiction with this other thing you had, right? You can say, okay, well, you don't you don't like do whatever, you don't rape people, and therefore you shouldn't drink milk or whatever it is because you're causing that to an
Mm.
animal. And then you could there's almost like any one of these examples in what we're doing, like the
Yeah.
harms that we're doing in the animal industry can be correlated to some other behavior which people don't participate in. Now,
Yeah.
when we get onto the issue of like antinatalism, a prerequisite of that conversation is your own spiritual beliefs about the nature of the universe. So, do you accept though that that is a necessary component? So it is an impasse that we've got to, because
Mm.
we have like different views about the nature and mechanics of the universe and stuff. But do you agree that like that makes antinatalism ultimately, it's always going to be, I don't think antinatalism is anything that is possible to discuss without first having an idea, or first bouncing off, like your first stepping stone is what's my spiritual views on the universe, and everything
Mm.
goes from there. You can't really like do it any other way. Do you see what I mean?
No, I 100% get. I 100% get what you mean. So, two things, just to touch. So, to touch on the relation you made to veganism first, and how people use like logical consistency tests and stuff. Um, I'm not sure about that one. So I agree. Those, like, I use those myself in veganism. I think they're accurate, and they're very good and simple tools you can use to explain to someone why it is morally retarded to exploit and kill other animals. Right now, can those same logical consistency tools be used for antinatalism? I agree that they are not as obvious and harder to explain. I do think there are some, but I haven't thought about them enough and refined them enough to be able to use them yet. So maybe it'll have to be something that I'd have to come back to in the future. I don't think I'm competent enough at using them, if there are any, um, at this point in time. So for the sake of argument, I can agree with you. Like, I will agree for the sake of argument now that there are not like analogous ones with antinatalism. I think there might be, but I haven't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah,
The
I think they're
second
all
thing
going to be.
about
There will be stuff that's analogous to antinatalism, but
yeah.
it would, like, I guess what I'm trying to get at with the veganism thing is that it's kind of it's a set of like morals which you can prove like internal contradiction, because it's internal within someone's moral framework of existing. Now, once we're kind of
No,
going out of the nature of existence, you have
yeah.
to bring in the element of, okay, well, what is existence? So you kind of, everything's going to then be muddied. Essentially, the conversation is going to be muddied by
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
someone's spiritual or religious belief is.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I think there still might be things that you can bring up that fit that with antinatalism. I just I'm in such the early stages about thinking about them that I can't coherently talk about them yet. So, as Tim Spears said, you can leave it. Um, I don't know if you're getting the reference from your debate with
I, d-
Tim Spears.
Oh yes.
Yeah, yeah. You know when you said this is anecdotal, take it or leave it, and he was like,
Take it
"Yeah,
or
I'll
leave
leave
it.
it."
And he said, "I'll leave."
And
To be fair, that was
I
that
just
was a
fucking
great
found that
that
hilarious.
was a
Yeah,
great
yeah, yeah.
answer.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
gotta
yeah.
hand it to him on that.
Tim,
That actually made me
Tim is
laugh
so
watching
good
him
with
back.
his like quick one-liners sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, that
Um,
was funny. That was funny.
yeah, yeah. But on the spiritual thing about like, does antinatalism essentially bottom out at like your spiritual beliefs about the universe or the cosmos or however you want to put it? Um, it could be. I'd have to think about it some more. There might be some ways that it doesn't, but it does seem like it does, like how we've reached somewhat of an impasse on that level here. Maybe there are going to be people in the comments that are shouting at me saying, Lawrence, you're a fucking idiot. There's such an easy way to reply to him. I can't think of it now. I do think that at some point, because the whole thing with antinatalism is the act of, because if people could choose to create themselves, I wouldn't have any issue with it, right? So if the world existed in how I think maybe you're suggesting it might, or maybe I'm mischaracterizing you a bit here, but if the world existed in a way where there were souls before we existed as humans, and those souls chose to be created as humans, I wouldn't have any issue with that, because it's individuals making decisions for themselves and the consequences of which they are going to bear the brunt of, right? So I have no issue with that. Just like I have no issue with people making decisions for themselves in this life, right? The issue I have is people making decisions and imposing harm on behalf of someone else, which I think is what people do when they create someone else, when they have a kid, right?
Can I
But
jump in a second here?
yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I just well, do you want to finish the point and I'll go back to it. I don't want to ruin your train, but
Yeah, so
I have
no, so the
another thing I
final
want to
thing
bring.
I was just yeah, the final thing I was just going to round off is, but this is where spirituality can muddy the waters, because um my issue is one or two people, I guess, taking a decision on behalf of someone else and imposing on behalf of someone else, but that assumes that that person who's being created hasn't made a decision, right? And is not an agent in that decision making process, right? But if you have a spiritual belief where they are an agent in that decision making process, which it maybe sounds like you believe, then it does muddy the waters. The thing that I would just say to that is like what I'd have to say before is I think you'd have to have pretty hard evidence to be able to justify the imposition of that harm and death on someone. You know, yeah. That's so.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
I
go.
guess one last thing I'll say, and I don't want to necessarily open a big can of worms here because obviously it's kind of getting late. But, so we could we
Yeah,
could
yeah,
we could always pick another time. But I just wanted to also just say, because the assumption that like there is obviously like, okay, there's no such thing, you can't possibly consent to your own being born and stuff. And I would say, well, the nature of the world that we do live in, where like we are born with like the propensity to reproduce, and not just the propensity but also the kind of the chemical I guess the chemical impulse and stuff to do so. And we see this like basically across the whole animal kingdom and amongst humans, like that
yep,
that's kind of like what we're designed by birth to do. I would say, shouldn't we also take if we're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the nature of how we should be living, if we're trying to get down to that question, but we look at our own physiology and we say, okay, well, we're designed to procreate. Should you not take that as, I guess, some kind of a sign as to, okay, well, this, I can't possibly be doing an unjust act, which I'm literally designed by the universe to perform, whether that's God or however you term it. Like, is it possible to use the tools of what the universe has provided you to do an injustice towards the universal like moral
I,
agency or whatever?
I I don't think so. I mean, maybe it gets a bit complicated when you talk about the universal moral agency, but the way I see it is I just view that as like an appeal to nature fallacy. Like, so basically, what you're saying is like we have dicks and vaginas and wombs and testicles, and so the universe is sending us a signal that surely it can't be wrong to use what we've been given by the universe or whatever. But like humans, I don't know if you believe like humans are herbivorous or omnivorous. Like it seems to me like we're omnivorous, and obviously we can be vegan, but like let's say it was an established fact of science that we definitely are omnivorous and we can eat animals, and naturally we would have, right, and we've got the biological tools to do that. Like, I don't think that provides moral justification. Like, if we don't have to engage in that immoral act, then we shouldn't. And so I think it's the same with procreation. Like, even if you don't think it's an immoral act, I don't think the fact that we can do it and naturally we would do it is a justification for doing it. I think we have to think about it on an ethical level and not on a natural level, if you get what I mean.
I do get what you mean. Yeah, I guess the difference there though would be that, like, with the example that you gave, like, what humans. Let's say that we're omnivorous in the sense that it wasn't just that we had to. Where was I going with this? Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm going off on one here. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, humans also have like empathy and stuff. Like compassion. That's
Mm.
something that we have, like, evolved as humans, and I would say that that's also something. So I had this this discussion with a guy here actually, and, like, he was saying, oh, but like, what about the fact that you like the smell of meat? Isn't that reason to say, well, you should eat meat? And I say, well, no, because I also, like, when I see animals getting killed, my ethical, my kind of compassion, like my impulse for compassion, like, outweighs that impulse of wanting to eat it when I smell meat, for instance. So, like, I kind of think, like, I don't think that a lion sits around and has any kind of moral
Mm.
concern with killing a zebra, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that lion is just like, okay, cool, that's my dinner. Because why would it possibly evolve to have compassion and empathy for the animal that it kills when it literally has to do it to survive? It wouldn't make any sense. It would be detrimental to its own existence if it had a moral issue with killing something it has to eat. So with humans, we've
Mm.
developed that. So I point to that as being like, okay, well, that's something we should listen to. So I think it goes both ways. You could say, oh, well, we can eat meat, but I would also say, like, we have the, and probably this happened over time. I'm not sure that a caveman or whatever living thousands of years ago might have had an issue with killing an animal, but we've developed it. We've somehow evolved this compassion towards non-human animals. So I would say that that is a
Mm.
sign that, like, you could point to and say, well, nature is, even if it's through a process of gradual evolution, is evolving us towards the point where we can live without eating animals, etc. So I do think it's a bit different, that question, and
Yeah.
it's a bit more complicated.
So, but one thing, I agree. I think the compassion does. Well, one, the compassion facilitates us thinking ethically. I think, like, because I think even if we were rational beings without compassion, um, I don't think we would necessarily get to veganism, because you kind of need the empathy and compassion to have any basic basis for ethics. If you get what I mean, like, empathy and compassion is what makes us care about suffering. So even if we were like intelligent, rational beings without the empathy and compassion, like, so basically what I'm saying is I agree with you. I think like empathy and compassion shows us that we shouldn't be causing this unnecessary suffering to animals and like imposing all this shit on them. But I like, and maybe you're seeing where I'm going with this, but I would just equally say, like, yeah, we have developed this compassion and empathy, and we should use that to resist imposing life and the risk of cancer and suffering and death on people, basically. So I would agree with you, but I would just extend it to antinatalism.
Yeah, but then I would say, well, is it possible to have compassion and empathy for someone who doesn't exist? I kind of feel like for me, at least at this point, being new to this, I find it impossible to, I find it
Mm.
possible, very, very possible, to have empathy for a non-human animal or another human or whatever. But I find it impossible to conceive of um, moral injustice to someone who doesn't actually, like, exist in the universe. And I'm not. Maybe that's something. Maybe, I could
Well, let
imagine
me
this
ask
being
you
an
a question
interesting.
which would
Okay, go on.
Well, let me ask you a question that maybe clear it up. So, if someone was doing something now that they actively knew would harm people in the future in a direct and measurable way, right? Um, like, those people don't exist yet, but you would still say that through our compassion and empathy, we can realize that person's doing something wrong, even though their victim isn't immediate.
Yes, that's true. That is true. If you can, yeah, like, when you term it that way and you say, okay, if someone isn't born, you're like, okay, I'm going to now try to conceive a child, and
Mm.
one day something's going to happen bad to them, and you knew it was, like, yes, you could theoretically have that compassion, but then I think that you would have to, but then you're bringing in an aspect of having to be able to predict the future on they're suffering. So you're still getting into the esoteric even there. You're still relying on an esoteric kind of branch to make that argument, because you're saying, well, now I have to know the future to be able to guarantee this person's going to have some kind of suffering. So whichever way
But
you
I
go,
don't.
like all doors lead to spirituality and esotericism. Is that the right word? Do you know
Well,
what I
I
mean?
don't. Yeah, to be honest, I don't really know what the word means, but I get what you're trying to say. I don't think you necessarily have to get into the spiritual realm with that. Like, if so, like, I'm making a bold assumption, but I'm assuming like you are fertile. So, like, you have the
I am
possibility
fertile.
of, yeah, okay. Don't say that with too much pride, young man. Anyway, so so I don't think antinatalists are trying to make a claim that they know the future. Like, we're just looking at reality, and it's like, well, there's so much stuff going on. Like, you don't have to be completely certain about the future to know that like your kid is going to be at a pretty high risk of cancer, or like you don't have to know the future to know that they're going to die and know that it might be in a very horrible way. So I don't think like appealing to the risks that come in with life in order to justify antinatalism is trying to make some sort of unreasonable claim about a knowledge about the future, because I think like we can be relatively um like sure about the general things that may happen and will happen to the kid, if you get what I mean.
Yeah. I do see what you're saying, but again, I would. I think then it just comes back to like, once again, do you believe that life? Do you believe that there's a possibility for some kind of transcendence through
Mm,
life? And I do. So, I would still say like, for me, the suffering argument, even though I was kind of pressing you on it, it was more just to find out whether your problem was the suffering aspect or the consent aspect, and whether you could
mm,
separate the two. But for me, the suffering thing doesn't actually take too high a precedence, because I still think that you can have transcendence through life, even with suffering, and actually, especially with suffering. So we're probably just going to disagree on the point of whether
yeah.
suffering is. Um, and I accept that, yeah, you bring someone into the world, there's a possibility to have suffering. But I also, yeah, I also just think like I don't blame the person bringing them into the world for that suffering. I think that, and again, it just comes back to my spiritual ideas. Like, I think that suffering is something which people go through for the purposes of becoming more spiritually aware or enlightened or whatever. And it's just one of those things for me.
Mm. So we've been going for a while, and like we could go on about like that for like another like hour or so, but I want to bring it back to um libertarianism, because that was like the original like topic for of discussion, and like to bring it back onto libertarianism, I kind of want to separate the spiritual side of it. So if it's possible, can you sort of like try and just put your libertarian hat on now and kind of separate your own spiritual sort of beliefs about the like the fucking what's it called, like the state of being or whatever you want to put it. um do you think, given what I was saying before about the fact that creating someone requires a imposition of suffering and death onto them, and also is done without their consent, and let's be honest, like it is probably the biggest initiation of force you can take against someone, because when you create them, you're literally opening them up to the vulnerability of any bad thing happening to them, if you get what I mean. Like, just the fact that they now exist, like, the risks may be large or small, but you've now put them in the position of being vulnerable to, state encroachment and things like this, and, mandatory injections and stuff like that. Like, those are things that you've now put someone in the firing line of. So, talking like as a libertarian now, do you think that libertarianism actually kind of does lead you to antinatalism?
I think the problem is like you have to. Everything is predicated on on that foundational kind of layer of what you believe life is about. I don't find it possible to separate the two. So I think that if I had if I could put myself in the shoes of someone who is kind of pure, I guess like pure atheist, pure antinatalist, doesn't believe that there's any purpose or meaning whatever to existence, and that in that case, yeah, then I could agree that that you could make a case that would be similar. You could make a libertarian case for it by saying, okay, well, like no one's consenting to their own being brought into the world, and then they're going to have all these things done to them. There might be some good things and some bad things. I can see it, but I also think that only makes sense from the lens of not having a kind of spiritual or a more religious, esoteric, some other view of life beyond that. Because if you would have to basically believe there's no meaning to life, and I believe there is meaning to life. So from my lens, there's no libertarian case for it.
Mm.
It doesn't follow because it's not in the same framework. But I can understand if someone doesn't have my views that you could
Mm.
make those arguments.
I got an interesting question, and maybe this can be like the last one, and it's directly
Yeah.
on libertarianism. So you were kind of saying like if you strip back everything and you take it from a sort of like atheist sort of, you don't believe anything is before like existence as a human, and you're libertarian, then maybe you can see antinatalism. But if you have certain other beliefs about life, then actually that initiation of force and imposition on someone else, or maybe I'm framing it badly, or that violation of consent is not seen as a bad thing. Could I then ask the question, like, let's say someone who exists, so let's say I have some sort of belief where I have a spiritual belief that I think justifies me imposing things on other people who already exist, like you or my next door neighbor. Now, I'm appealing to my spiritual belief to justify that imposition of force or violation of consent. But do you think that I would still, if I was doing that to someone who already exists, do you think I would still be able to reputably call myself a libertarian?
I might need an example, but I would say no, just based on what your description is there. Yeah, like if you've got a spiritual
So
belief and you think, okay, well, let's say you believe that, I mean, you could even go as far as say like, let's say you believe that like people of a certain race or whatever are spiritually superior, and
yeah,
therefore other people should be kind of, should have fewer rights or whatever. Then no, of course,
yeah.
there's no libertarian cause for that.
Mm.
Yeah.
So if those spiritual beliefs don't justify an imposition on existing people and the violation of their consent, why do you think that your spiritual beliefs or other similar spiritual beliefs justify and also an imposition and violation of consent onto someone who is about to be created?
Well, because I think that the core difference is that, like in the example that you gave there, when you're doing it to another person, is that they actually have the propensity to object. They actually have the propensity to object to. They can they can express their consent or non-consent. Whereas in the example of someone who is not born, who's whatever form that exists in, there is no concept of consent because there is no being to consent. You see what I'm saying? So I
Mm,
put it in a totally different, like it's an interesting philosophical question, but I think that if there is no concept of consent, because there is no one to consent, you again, like for your antinatalist kind of approach, you have to kind of fast forward the clock to, once that person's come into existence, to start then talking about the whether they consented to it. Whereas I think that at that moment there is no such concept as consent because there is
mm.
no being to consent. So I think that's where I sit on it at the moment.
Yeah. I think that, like, and I'm trying not to continue the conversation because I know we've been going for so long, but I think, like, I would just say to that is the thing I said before about how, sure, there's no one now that you're violating the consent of, but the action you're taking entails the violation of someone's consent further down the line, if you get what I mean. That was the thing I was trying to say. Do you want to respond to that, or do you want to close? Totally up to you.
Yeah, let's close because I think yeah, my brain is definitely a bit fried, and I'm not sure I have anything
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
anything more intelligent to add at this point. But we can do another one. Like I said, I would like to discuss some of the other things that you said about
Mm.
about the nature of like animals and this whole paradigm, like all that kind of stuff. So it'd be good to delve further. But I think it's probably a good point to close this one off.
Cool. So, yeah, we'll definitely do another conversation like whenever we're both free and whenever we both want to. But before we close, just so that, if anyone's been like interested by what you've said about libertarianism or spirituality or just likes you as a person, like where can they follow your stuff? Just sort of like plug yourself.
Yeah, so basically, I have a podcast called the Staying Free Podcast. That one can be found on all the major podcast channels. So just search the Staying Free Podcast. The Twitter account for that is Staying Free Pod. And over there, you can find, if you go into the media tab, there's like a bunch of kind of snippets from the conversations and stuff like that, little trailers and stuff, so people can get a flavor for it. My Twitter is Jonny Hodl, so people want to connect with me, they can connect with me there. Actually, the podcast is also on YouTube as well, so if your audience is mainly YouTubers, they can find it there. It's not caught up yet, but it should be in a couple of months, so it's getting there. So yeah, there's a bunch of places to find it. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I'll link all those in the description. Like if there's any links that you think will be difficult for me to find for whatever reason, like just send them to me. I'll include them all. But like thanks so much for coming on, Jonny. Like I've enjoyed seeing you in the other things like you've been in with Lauren and David. And like it's been great to talk to you now. And I definitely want to have another conversation, especially after having a trip. I think that one would be really interesting. But yeah, like thanks so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely, man. Yeah, it's been good, and yeah, look forward to talking to you after. So good luck on the trip, and look forward to the next one. Thanks for inviting me.